Hello there, people of the internet. I have no idea why, but I've been making a bunch of 556 videos recently, and I've had a bunch of people get into my comments and tell me that 556, specifically 55 grain lead core rounds, don't fragment upon impact with a target. And I have no idea why people think this, but that tells me that these guys have never sat back to watch a ballistic gel testing. I get it, ballistic gel doesn't directly mimic what happens inside of a human body, but there's been a ton of experiences of bullets fragmenting, not just in ballistic gel or even like two-legged critters, but also four-legged critters. Like I myself have used 55 grain lead core against a good number of things, and where the mindset of 55 grain bullets don't fragment comes from, I have no idea. Like, green tip might have some trouble with fragmenting, especially if we're talking about green tip like M855 through a shorter barrel to the point to where you don't really get the velocities that you need to in order to properly get the thing to tumble and fragment, especially if we're talking about shooting them through a 1 in 7 twist barrel, because they're going to be extremely stabilized in that 1 in 7 twist barrel, and so whenever they smack into a target, they're still going to be stabilized as they go through that gelatinous target. Of course, this might vary if you're shooting through like brush or concrete or car doors or something else like that, but if you're shooting at just a gelatinous non-armored target, which most of us are going to be shooting at if we ever have to engage anything with green tip for whatever reason, if you're using a 1 in 7 twist barrel, which M4s are, and you're using a short barrel, which M4s have, then that over-stabilized green tip round is just going to kind of poke a hole right through that target, because by the time that bullet unstabilizes enough to be able to tumble and yaw, it is on the outside of that target. But I think that might be where this is coming from. But a 55 grain lead core round, especially at 5.56 velocities, especially from a full-length barrel, like say a 20-inch barrel like my M16 right here, that fragments exceptionally well against a soft gelatinous target. And there are a fair number of tests that prove this point, and why people are so abhorrently invested into the idea that lead core rounds do not fragment simply because they're full metal jackets, I just don't know. Keep in mind that these full metal jackets that we're firing are extremely lightweight, and they are designed to go at really high velocities. Whether you're smacking gel or just like water, you can see these rounds absolutely break apart. Like, you can go and look online, and there's 1.5 million YouTube channels that have done 55 grain tests with ballistic gels, and in basically all of them, they fragment. Now, as you get out to longer distances, like say, if you're using 16-inch barrel or greater with 5.56 ammunition, proper velocity 5.56 ammunition, then you should be good out to like 3, potentially even 400 yards in order to have the velocities necessary to get that round to fragment. But the 5.56 55 grain lead core round fragments extremely well. And that is one of the reasons why it's so good at departing a bunch of energy onto its target. Because normally if you have, like, say, a 308 round, like a large, relatively heavy in comparison to 5.56 bullet, like, say, a 150 grain bullet that's a full metal jacket, that's a lot of mass, and that mass holds itself together extremely well. Kind of like how if you have a really thin stick, it's easier to break in half than a really thick log, which you really have to struggle to break that thing in half. Mass just holds things together better. And a 55 grain bullet, that's a little tiny bullet traveling really, really fast, and whenever it smacks into a gelatinous target, it breaks apart really, really quickly. We see the same sort of phenomenon, like, say, if somebody jumps off of a bridge and they belly flop on water. Because of the way that gelatinous material is, and it has relatively the same principles and properties as water does, that water may as well be concrete. And oftentimes, whenever somebody slaps onto water in the wrong way, they break apart. Or you could like do a less gruesome example, get a cinder block and throw it into some water from say 100 feet in the air. Odds are that cinder block is going to reach terminal velocity and smack that water with enough force to break that cinder block apart. Granted, cinder blocks aren't very aerodynamic to begin with, but hopefully you guys can understand my example. That little tiny bullet with a very minimal amount of mass does not hold itself together very well whenever it travels at Mach Jesus out of your full-length barrel rifle and smacks into your target. Now, all of that being said, there's certain things that we can do to try to ensure that your 55 grain Full Metal Jacket round is going to tumble and break apart as effectively as possible. Going back to the twist rate, if you send a 55 grain pill through a 14.5 inch barrel or a 16 inch barrel or a like shorter barrel and you're rocking say 223 ammunition, then you're not going to have the velocity necessary to be able to really fragment that bullet to its full effectiveness. Of course, it's still going to fragment within like most of your practical distances, but if you start touching out to any real legitimate distance, then you might start seeing some issues. As you shorten your barrel length, you're also going to decrease your velocity, thus decreasing your chance of that round breaking apart upon impact. All of that being said, if that round is at a low enough velocity to not break apart upon impact just from the velocity dependent situations alone, then what comes next is the tumbling effect. And a tumbling effect, like 99% of the time, will break apart your 5.56 rounds. Even the steel, like the steel penetrator green tip rounds, once they start tumbling, they break apart exceptionally well. They fragment exceptionally well. And the same thing goes with your lead core 55 grain bullets, which have a higher velocity and a higher chance of breaking apart. But if they don't break apart, if they don't reach those velocities to be able to effectively break apart, let's say you're using a short barrel, you're shooting at something at a long distance, you can actually adjust your twist rate to try and make up for that. Because a higher twist rate, or I guess a slower twist rate, like say a 1 in 10 or a 1 in 12 twist out of your barrel, those will stabilize your 55 grain bullets a lot less than say a 1 in 7 twist will. One of the same reasons why 62 grain green tip out of a 1 in 9 twist barrel are far more likely to tumble whenever they smack into a target in comparison to the 1 in 7 twist. So twist weight absolutely does matter. And if you get to a twist rate that barely stabilizes your 55 grain bullets, you want it stabilized enough to get really good accuracy from your rounds, but you want it to unstabilize pretty much as soon as it smacks into a target. And basically, it turns into a tumble upon impact round. And that tumbling inside of that gelatinous material at those hyper velocities are just a really, really good way to make that bullet break apart and ensure that a bunch of that energy is transferred onto your target. Now, it doesn't always happen. There's a lot of variables that goes into it, like combinations of bullet weight with barrel length, with twist rate, with what sort of targets it is that you're shooting at. Like if you're shooting at some naked, scrawny meth head in your yard at 15 yards and you're using your 7.5 inch AR pistol with some green tip in it, you might get a different effect than if you were shooting at that same scrawny meth head. Or maybe it's some fat guy and you have a 20-inch 5.56 with a 1 in 12 twist barrel and 55 grain bullets. God, that would just be wholeheartedly devastating on a target like that. But there's a lot of factors that goes into it. But by a pretty huge margin at the practical distances that even like your modern militaries would fight at, like within 300 yards, your most common AR-15 barrel lengths, like your 16-inch and your 20-inch, there are other pistol barrel lengths out there, but most people are opting for the 16 or the 20-inch simply so we don't have to worry about like what we can and cannot do with our particular firearms or potentially having to register them or any sort of those gray area things. Most people just opt for the 16 or the 20-inch from my personal experience that I've seen with the amount of people that I've talked to who own the AR platform of some kind. But with those particular platforms, in most of your practical distances, even with like no matter what twist rate it is that you're rocking, your 55 grain bullet is going to fragment whenever it smacks onto a gelatinous target. If we're talking about body armor, that's a whole other topic. We can get like way into the weeds of the effectiveness of 5.56 against body armor and what would be the best options to go with there, but we'll go ahead and we'll save that for some other video to be done in the future. But the bottom line is 55 grain is extremely good at fragmenting against most of the distances that we'll most likely be facing anything at from most of the rifles that most of us have. And why people think that 5.56 55 grain lead core doesn't fragment on target, despite the fact that we have just this overwhelming abundance of evidence to prove that it does. Literally just type into the YouTube search bar 5.56 55 grain versus gel or versus water or versus anything, and you'll see that little tiny lead core bullet fragment horrendously and transfer a tremendous amount of energy onto that target as it does. So all of that being said, thanks for watching, folks. I appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, share. Description below is a link to all sorts of stuff. Go check it out. You guys go off. Have yourself a fantastic day. I'll see you on the next episode.
Been a little while since I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. Poor man's Garrett. It's a shame that bolt-action shotguns aren't more mainstream.